Hello, this is Grandmaster Brian Smith presenting a DVD for the Chess World. The subject of this DVD will be evaluation. Obviously, one of the most crucial aspects of thinking in chess and decision making, along with calculation and our basic knowledge of typical plans and openings and so on. So evaluation involves not just knowing who stands better and who stands worse, or if the position is equal, drawn, or winning, let's say. These things are, of course, very important. It's crucial to have an idea who stands better in a game you're playing, because this will affect what kind of decisions you'll make. For instance, whether you'll go into an equalizing line. Let's say you calculate a line that leads to equality. You need to know if you stand better, in which case before you reach in the current position, in which case you wouldn't go into such a line. But if you stand worse, you might be very happy to go into such a line. So this is very important, but chess evaluation involves more than just knowing who stands better and who stands worse. It also involves breaking down the position into its elements and understanding what is actually going on in the position. What are the stakes? What are both players fighting for? Where is the battle taking place? Which advantages and disadvantages does each side have? These are all very important things to be able to understand in order to come up with the right plan and simply to be able to calculate the right moves. A human being, unlike a computer, can't look at every legal move, so the evaluation of the position can lead to a general plan, which will allow us to find the moves which we need to calculate. This DVD is broken down into essentially 4 different groups of imbalances in the chess game. There is, first of all, the most basic imbalance, which everyone learns essentially as a beginner. If you have reached this level, the level in chess where you're watching this DVD, you learned it in one of your first steps in chess, which is material. Obviously, if one player has more pieces than the other, or more valuable pieces, this will constitute an imbalance in that player's favor. We also, in that section, we'll talk about situations where the material is in theoretical balance, but has unlike forces. So, for instance, a bishop against a knight, which are considered to be approximately equal pieces. Well, of course, it's more complicated than that, but it's close enough. But each piece can have advantages in different types of positions and disadvantages in others. Or queen and pawn against 2 rooks. We cover this kind of imbalance, and other things like an exchange in 2 pawns again for a minor piece and 2 pawns against a rook. So the balance of force, though, of course, is a very important imbalance in a game of chess. Second group will be space. And some could say that space and that force, material that is an element of space, because if you have more pieces, you can control more of the board. This is true, but I decided to make it separate because it's such a huge category otherwise. So spatial control, is a very important imbalance, and player having this advantage over the whole board or one sector of the board, it can lead to different types of plans, specific kinds of plans as a result. So also controlling the most important squares, the central squares, for instance, or squares around the opponent's king. These are also elements of spatial control. The next one we talk about will be time. And time means essentially things like a lead in development, more active forces that are creating threats first. So situations where both sides are attacking, who has the initiative. This is, of course, crucial in chess evaluation. And then finally, we have harmony. And by harmony, I include both how the pieces work together, as well as the pawn structure. So do your opponent or you have weak pawns or passed pawns, these kinds of things, and how well the pieces work together, poorly placed pieces. So these are all the basics categories we'll be covering in this course of imbalances, and we'll see how these work together. And of course, examples in one section will also, there will be a big overlap that's inevitable, because very rarely are there positions where there's only one imbalance. Let's categorize it essentially in this way. Now, to begin with, we'll see how chess evaluation, how important it is for determining our plan. This position occurred in a fairly famous game by Alexander Alekhine, who had the white pieces, against Yefim Bogolubov, who had the black pieces. This took place in a tournament. I believe it was a tournament. Actually, might have been a training match, but I'm not sure. But anyway, it was. Yeah, I think it was a tournament. Budapest, 1921. Alekhine had the white pieces, and the position you have here. Let's just start to evaluate it. First of all, what we can see, there's one fully open file, which is the D file, and control of this file is a very important imbalance for. The fight for this file will be important for both players' plans. Second of all, there is opposing majorities on two sides of the board. So I think I would categorize this as space, and we'll see that in this game, Alekhine's improving of his spatial control proves to be decisive in this game. But essentially on the king side, because of his 4-3 majority there, he has a potential space. He has an actual space advantage which can grow at this point, and this will be a major factor in his future play. Black, for his part, has the queen side majority, and in a different kind of position, this 3-2 majority that Black has on the queen side could be very relevant, and there have been many instructive games played on this theme, and in fact, in some ways, this game was considered a little bit revolutionary in a way, I guess, in a textbook kind of way, where Alekhine showed that the 4-3 majority on the king side, previously there had been a dogma that the queen side majority was more relevant, which would be the case in some endgames here, because both kings are on the king side, and a queenside pass pawn, if Black created one, would divert White's pieces. But in the middle game, Alekhine showed that this 4-3 majority can actually be on the king side, can actually be very, very dynamic, and this game was important for that. So actually, here White's last move was Rook F to D1, which is a very natural move. But when you realize, of course, that the battle for the D file is going on, that leads to this move. It's just that for most experienced players, this move would be second nature, because we immediately see this battle for the D file, and the inactive rook on F1, which needs to be activated. So this real evaluation is going on in a little bit of a subconscious level, in such a simple position at least. But nevertheless, it's there. For a beginner, rook F to D1 might not be obvious. So White fights for the D file, and the Black has a bit of a problem here. Is that if he takes on D4, White will take back with the queen, and now will control the D file. Black won't be able to oppose with rook to D8 because that would drop the rook. So it becomes a little hard for Black to fight for the D file. And another problem that Black is facing is that this queen is aimed at this pawn on A7. So this also keeps Black from being able to successfully fight for the D file, because the rook on A8 will need to guard it. So for that reason, Bogolubov played B6 here, a move which will ultimately be necessary. So White's slight pressure on Black's queenside pawns can also be a factor in our evaluation of this position. I don't know how the players evaluated it during the game. Most likely Alekhine thought his position was better. I don't know about Bogolubov, but he might have also thought he had at least good chances here, but Alekhine proved to be more accurate. So here Alekhine played a move which you would not be able to find by any kind of calculation, and it's essentially just introduces the plan, which is directly connected to the imbalance of the position. Alekhine sees his potential space advantage on the king side. The d-file at the moment is in a state of flux. Neither side completely controls it, although white has better chances there. Alekhine therefore prepares to advance his pawns on the king side, gaining space there and using his 4-3 majority. And he shows that the black pieces are not very harmoniously placed on f6 and e6. So the move Alekhine played now was h3, a move which has no concrete immediate, of course doesn't create any kind of immediate threat. It doesn't immediately activate any white's pieces or create any kind of immediate attack. So it's not the kind of move you can find without an evaluation of the position followed by the creation of a plan. But basically the idea is white will be playing f4 and ultimately even g4, and this proves to be surprisingly powerful. So the g4 square is important to guard, because otherwise if white plays f4 immediately, black might have knight g4, bothering white's queen. But also there's and then queen c5, for instance, pinning. But also it's necessary to play to control g4 at some point. So h3 white played. And here Bogolubov used his own majority with the move c5, which is, I think, based on an overly optimistic evaluation of the position, which might be due to this idea that the queenside majority was superior. Bogolubov hoped to simply push on the queenside, which was similar to a famous game of Capablanca's, which I'm not sure if it had been played before this game, but there have been a number of thematic games with just the pushing of the queenside majority. And so c5 was a little bit too optimistic, and one of the problems is it gives away the d5 square. If he fully understood what white's plan was with f4, g4, f5, e5, and so on, and how threatening it was, he would have probably refrained from this move, which makes white's play much stronger. So black should probably try to anticipate white's play with a move like knight e8. At least this is what Alekhine recommended, is this knight e8, moving the knight from, which it looks a little passive, but the knight turns out on f6 doesn't do much. And then he can try also to play g6 and control the f5 square, and maybe knight to g7, and basically try to kind of turtle up here, maybe with f6 as well, and just resign himself to pure defense for the time being. But his evaluation was too optimistic, and he tried to use his queenside majority in a situation where it turned out not to be effective. So here Alekhine, again, keeping in mind the open d-file, he doesn't want to give up the d-file. So he played rook 4 to d2. Of course, the rook needs to move, but rook takes d8 and after rook takes d8, then the d-file would become essentially, neither side would really control it. White would not have any superior kind of control in the d-file. And in fact, it might even be black who has the better chances, because he has this support square d4. So this would make a major difference in the game, in the evaluation of the position. Black would then be able to trade on d1, put his queen on the d-file, and his light-squared bishop would turn out to be better than white's. This bishop on e6. As black's queenside pawns advance, it could start to threaten a2. So instead, Alekhine played this rook 4 to d2, keeping the black rook on a8 out of the game for now. And so here, Bogolubov couldn't really keep the felt he couldn't keep the tension and now took on d2. Maybe it was worth considering something else, but it's probably actually, again, he could consider knight to e8, although I think that giving away the d5 square is important, and maybe he shouldn't have done that. But so he decided to take on d2 with the aim to further push on the d file. So queen takes d2. Again, white has two choices of recapture. When we consider how important the d file is, the queen recapture is obvious. If rook takes d2, then rook d8. So queen takes d2, and black played c4. So he's trying again to use his queen set majority, but this is probably yet another overly ambitious move, not realizing how dangerous white's plan was and imagining that he could more easily push the queen side majority than actually was the case. So again, I think here he needed to start anticipating white's play with knight e8, g6, and so on, and try to play defense. c4 black played, now f4. So this kind of position, we know the e and f pawn are a very important duo of pawns which can really advance and sweep away black's pieces. Black's pieces turned out to be, especially these two pieces, e6 and f6, turned out to be lacking in harmony. They can be attacked and driven to poor squares, and he doesn't. They both want the d7 square as they get attacked, and that's a problem. So here black played g6. So he covers the f5 square and makes some room for his king potentially to get off the back rank. If otherwise white was just playing e5 followed by f5. Let's say black wanted to go a6, imagining that he was going to push on the queen side. White's play would be much faster with e5, attacking the knight, and then knight d7, f5, and very graphically illustrated the lack of harmony in black's pieces. The bishop is just trapped. And otherwise, if knight e8, let's say, for instance, then f5, bishop retreats, and then knight to d5, and white's position is becoming overwhelming. And we'll see in a second, the queen trade is not good for black either. If let's say queen c5, queen d4 rook takes, black's position immediately is falling apart because c4 is under attack, b6 is under attack, and white's pieces are just too too dominating of a position. For instance, b5, already white wins with knight b6, rook b8, rook d8, and both the knight and the bishop are under attack. So black played g6. If queen c5 here as well, queen d4, and after queen trade, then black's queen side is simply too weak. The pawn on c4 now has become weak, and squares in general, such as the knight, can jump into b5 and come in this way. It's just black can't survive. Immediate threat is f5, driving the bishop away and then taking the c4 pawn. And if rook c8, once again black has the problem that his pieces lack harmony, and after f5 followed by e5 or e5 followed by f5, black will lose a piece. For instance, f5 driving the bishop to d7, e5 driving the knight away and winning a piece. So black played g6, now queen d4. Very powerful centralizing move. And white threatens f5 now, once again winning the pawn on c4. Rook to c8, black played. This pawn had to be defended. It would be hopeless if he lost this pawn. And now, once again, it might look like a normal position when you first look at this position, you first come to it. Well, black has the queen side majority, white has the king side majority. Maybe recognize that the queen on d4 is very well placed, but it's okay. At some point, perhaps black can offer the queen trade or drive it away in some other way. But looking deeper, you'll see that white's space advantage on the king side and the poorly placed black pieces and white's central control gives him a decisive advantage. And the way to do it is once again to prepare the pawn advance on the king side and center with f5 and e5. And this leads us to this move g4, which looks perhaps on the very surface that it's weakening white's king position, and it's obviously true. You have to watch when you make a move like this. King position is an element in our the safety of the king, of course, is a very important element, which will come into the harmony section, because it seems like the most natural place to put king position. Because white has the initiative, he's able to do this. And here Bogolubov, realizing the enormous problems he's facing, finally decided to take a desperate measure, sacrificing the bishop for 2 pawns, exposing the white king. But the problem was that black didn't have enough pieces to create a real attack against the white king, and white still had the advantage to this position in the center, in particular the knight coming into this outpost square on d5, which has existed ever since black played c5. So we'll look at the continuation in a moment, but just to show why Bogolubov took this drastic decision, White's threat is f5 followed by e5 or possibly g5 and then knight to d5, completely overwhelming the black position. So, for instance, if black played rook to c7, hoping to secure a retreat for his bishop on c8, then f5, and now if black takes on f5, here we'll see a couple example variations. Of course, there's many ways black could play, but white's basically playing f5 and e5 after everything. If g takes f5, for instance, then e takes f5 is strong. G takes f5 is also good. Now the bishop is under attack, bishop c8. Of course, if rook d7, in all these cases, white has queen e5 here. And the bishop is now pinned on d7 if the rooks are traded, and otherwise has no escape as well because it's trapped. Meanwhile, so bishop c8, then g5, and this illustrates how white's advance is so strong. Knight e8, for instance, knight d7 makes no difference. Knight d5, and after queen takes g5 check, king h2. Black is white's threatening both knight takes c7 and also the pinning move rook to g1. So this turns out to be hopeless for black. If instead black plays rook to d7 immediately here, also queen e5, and black loses because the bishop is trapped, and if the rooks are traded, then white simply recaptures and the bishop is pinned. Meanwhile, if bishop c8 immediately, then here white can play e5, again with knight to d5 following, and the black rook being pinned. Also, we can look at, let's say, rook f8, trying to avoid the fork on d5, and also make an escape for the bishop. Any other rook move would also be equivalent. Then, for instance, here e5, and the knight is driven to a very unfortunate square e8, because if knight to d7, then comes f5, and the bishop is trapped. Knight to e8, f5 anyway, bishop is driven back, f6, okay, knight to d5 is also possible, but then the queen would come into h4, which could be a little bit annoying. Also pretty good for white, but looks like f6 is the most crushing here, because it just locks black's pieces in. For instance, queen e6, bishop e4, and black has no moves here essentially. His knight can only go to c7, and if If he does nothing, then knight to d5 or bishop d5 are coming. If knight c7, then queen d6 forces the queen trade and creates for white a decisive passed pawn. Knight e6, d7, bishop, d7, bishop a6, knight to d5, for instance. And black is without any hope here. The pawn on d7 ties his position down, and threats like knight e7 and knight c6 are coming. So this, of course, just an example variation. In fact, white has many good ways to play after black's various moves, but hopefully this is sufficient to show that this plan of f5 and e5 is so strong that black had to resort to capturing on g4 and sacrificing the bishop. So h takes g4, knight takes g4. Now the position has changed. We can evaluate it again. In general, you should be, as you're playing, you should be reevaluating the position very frequently. We'll see some examples in this course where a player misevaluates the position. Often position may have been favorable in the past, but due to some sort of mistake, whether perhaps the player didn't recognize it, losing touch with the reality on the board. So it's always important to reevaluate it, but especially after such a change as what's just occurred. Black sacrificed a piece. A lot has changed. Now white has to basically cover the king side. He is up a minimal amount of material, but this knight to d5 is going to be so strong that black's not the only one attacking. So he recognizes that black's main and pretty much only idea is queen h4, followed by queen g3 or queen h2 or something like that, trying to create an attack. So white simply played king g2, stopping that threat, because now if queen h4, white can just play rook h1 and drive the queen right back, and then knight to d5, and white's attack will be overwhelming. So king to g2, little move, improving the harmony of white's position and stopping black's ideas. Bogolubov played h5. There's not really anything else. White still controls the game, and black's attack is not going anywhere. Now knight to d5. Of course, the knight jumps in, attacking the queen. The queen could retreat somewhere, but it wasn't going to be. The position was still just terrible for black. So instead he played queen h4, and after rook h1, once again stopping black's threat, queen to d8, bishop d1, and here black resigned, since there's no defense against white, just taking the knight, followed by knight to f6, for instance. And black is not only facing material, or the immediate threat, of course, is to take and then rook h8, but even if black could defend against that, knight f6 is coming, so black's not only down material, but also facing a decisive attack, and white has total control over the center. Black resigned. So this has been the introduction to my course. Alekhine could only find really this h3 move, and then the future plan of f4, f5, g4, and e5, and so on, based on noticing that white's play was on the king's side, finding where white's play is. It may have looked simple once it's demonstrated here, but great players like Alekhine make things look simple, and a lesser player may have gone wrong somewhere, perhaps even tried to play on the queen's side, some other kinds of things. Even quite decent players might, let's say, for instance, determine that they would not find this idea, let's say, and start exchanging rooks on the d-file and head for a drawish position, this kind of thing. But it was very drastic how Alekhine showed that this simple plan was so crushing.